If he once made you feel chosen, special, and deeply seen, and later left you confused, guilty, and questioning yourself, this video is for you. Because one of the most powerful forms of narcissistic manipulation doesn't feel like abuse at all. It feels like love. Many people don't stay because they're afraid. They stay because, at some point, it felt extraordinary. He said things like, "I've never felt this with anyone. You're different from everyone else. I see a future with you. You're the only one who understands me." And when you heard those words, something inside you opened. Not because you were naive, but because humans are wired to respond to connection and hope. This is where the confusion begins. Love bombing doesn't look like manipulation, it looks like intensity. In the beginning, everything moves fast. Deep conversations, constant contact, emotional closeness, future talk, strong bonding. It feels meaningful. It feels validating. It feels like finally being chosen. And because it feels good, your nervous system lowers its guard. That's not a mistake. That's biology. Then the shift happens, and you don't understand why. Suddenly, the warmth fades. The attention becomes inconsistent. The promises slow down. The affection becomes conditional. And when you ask what changed, you don't get clarity. You get guilt. You're too sensitive. You're overthinking. Why do you always create problems? That's when the second layer of manipulation begins. Guilt replaces connection. Instead of feeling close, you feel responsible. Responsible for the tension, his mood, the distance, fixing what broke. You start trying harder. And this is where many people turn the blame inward. Maybe I ruined something good. Maybe I asked for too much. But the truth is simpler and harder to see. The future promise becomes the hook. Just when you start pulling away, the future reappears. He reminds you, "We'll be okay. Things will get better. I still want a future with you. Not now, not consistently, but eventually." That future promise keeps you emotionally invested in the present pain. You're no longer staying for what is happening. You're staying for what might happen. This is not love, it's emotional leverage. Love bombing creates attachment. Guilt creates compliance. Future promises create hope. Together, they form a loop that keeps you engaged, even when you're unhappy. And because this loop uses love language, many people don't recognize it as manipulation until much later. Why this video matters. If you've ever wondered, was it real? Did he mean it? Why did I believe him? You're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what did that intensity do to your nervous system? And that's what we'll unpack next. In the next part, I'll explain why love bombing creates such a strong emotional bond, and why it's so hard to let go. Even when you know the truth. One of the reasons love bombing is so hard to recognize, and even harder to let go of, is because it doesn't register as manipulation in your body. It registers as meaning. People often say, "It felt spiritual. It felt fated. It felt like we had known each other forever." And that feeling wasn't imagined. Love bombing creates a false sense of intimacy by accelerating emotional closeness before safety has been established. Intensity creates the illusion of depth. When connection develops slowly, your nervous system has time to evaluate consistency. But love bombing skips that phase entirely. Instead, it overwhelms you with constant attention, emotional disclosure, rapid attachment, shared fantasies of the future, validation at a high frequency. Your body doesn't read this as too much. It reads it as belonging. And belonging is one of the strongest survival signals the human nervous system recognizes. Why your body confuses intensity with compatibility. Here's what most people don't understand. Your nervous system is not designed to detect manipulation. It's designed to detect connection and relief. When someone offers intense emotional availability early on, your body releases dopamine reward, oxytocin bonding, adrenaline, excitement. That chemical combination feels powerful. It creates a sensation people describe as chemistry, spark, soulmate energy. But chemistry is not character. The trauma factor that deepens the bond. If you had unresolved emotional wounds, abandonment, neglect, invisibility, or being too much, love bombing feels like repair. It touches the exact places that once hurt. You feel finally chosen, deeply seen, emotionally mirrored, temporarily safe. That relief imprints strongly on your nervous system. So when the love bombing disappears later, your body doesn't think, "This was unhealthy." It thinks, "I lost something vital." Why logic doesn't break the bond? This is why people say, I know what he did, but I still miss him. That's not weakness. That's conditioning. Your body bonded to the state love bombing created, not the person himself. And once bonded, the nervous system seeks that state again, even when the source becomes harmful. The shift from connection to control. After the bond forms, intensity becomes inconsistent. Warmth turns conditional. Attention becomes unpredictable. Affection is replaced by criticism or distance. This inconsistency doesn't weaken the bond, it strengthens it. Why? Because intermittent reinforcement is neurologically addictive. Your body learns, if I try harder, the closeness might return. And that hope keeps you engaged. Why this feels personal, but isn't. When love bombing fades, many people think, what did I do wrong? Why did he change? But the change wasn't about you. Love bombing was never meant to last. It was meant to bond you quickly, so less effort would be required later. The truth that brings relief. If it felt real, it's because your body experienced it as real. That doesn't mean it was healthy, and it doesn't mean you imagined it. It means your nervous system responded exactly as it was designed to respond. In the next part, we'll explore how guilt is introduced after love bombing fades, and why guilt becomes the main tool that keeps you attached. After love bombing fades, many people expect distance to create clarity. Instead, something far more confusing takes its place: guilt. This is where the manipulation becomes quieter and far more effective. You're no longer being pulled in by affection. You're being held in place by responsibility. A woman once said, I wasn't staying because I was happy. I was staying because I felt bad leaving. That sentence reveals the shift perfectly. Guilt enters when love becomes conditional. Once the bond is established, the narcissist begins changing the emotional rules. Warmth becomes inconsistent. Affection comes and goes. Approval feels earned, not given. And when you notice the change, you're met with responses like, you're too sensitive. Why do you always take things the wrong way? I can't do anything right with you. You're the one creating problems. These statements subtly reframe the situation. The problem is no longer his behavior. The problem is your reaction. That's how guilt is introduced. Guilt shifts focus away from harm. Instead of asking, why does this hurt? You begin asking, why am I like this? Why do I react this way? Why can't I just be normal? This shift is devastating, because it redirects your attention inward, away from the unhealthy dynamic. And once your focus is inward, self-doubt grows. Why guilt is more powerful than affection. Affection attracts you. Guilt binds you. When guilt enters the picture, leaving no longer feels like it feels like abandonment. You worry, you're being unfair. You're hurting him, you're giving up to eyes, you're failing as a partner. And because you're empathetic, those thoughts matter. Guilt keeps you engaged, even when love is gone. The emotional labor trap. At this stage, many people start working harder emotionally. You try to explain yourself better, be more patient, regulate his moods, prevent conflict, prove you're not the problem. This emotional labor becomes exhausting, but the more you try, the less you receive, and the more responsible you feel. That imbalance is not accidental. Why guilt feels moral, but isn't. One of the most confusing aspects of this stage is that guilt feels like integrity. You think, I don't want to be cruel. I want to do the right thing. I don't want to hurt someone I love. But guilt here is not about ethics. It's about conditioning. It's the internalized belief that your needs cause harm. This is where many people lose themselves. As guilt deepens, boundaries blur, needs shrink, self-trust erodes, identity softens. You become more careful, more accommodating, more quiet. Not because you want to, but because guilt tells you that taking space is wrong. The truth that begins breaking the spell. Guilt only works when you believe, I'm responsible for his emotions. Once that belief weakens, guilt loses power. And the moment guilt loses power, the dynamic begins collapsing. In the next part, we'll explore how future promises are used to neutralize guilt, and why they keep you emotionally invested, even when nothing changes. When guilt alone is no longer enough to keep you emotionally engaged, narcissists introduce something far more powerful. The future. Not a real future. A promised future. This is where many people stay far longer than they ever intended. Not because they're happy, but because they're hopeful. A woman once said, I wasn't staying for who he was. I was staying for who he said he would become. That sentence explains this stage perfectly. Future promises shift your attention away from the present. When the relationship starts hurting, Your mind naturally looks for meaning. Future promises offer that meaning. He says things like, once this phase passes, we'll be okay. I just need time. Things will be different soon. I still want a life with you. You're the one I see myself with. These statements don't fix the present. They suspend it. Your pain is no longer something to respond to now. It becomes something to endure for later. Why waiting feels responsible, not harmful. Many people don't see this as manipulation, because waiting feels mature. You think, relationships take work. No one is perfect. I shouldn't give up, so easily. Future promises frame endurance as virtue. You begin to believe that leaving would mean you lacked patience, you didn't believe enough, you didn't give it time, you abandoned potential. So instead of asking, is this healthy? You ask, am I strong enough to hold on? The future becomes emotional currency. Each promise becomes a small emotional payment. Not enough to heal the relationship, but enough to keep you invested. The pattern looks like this. Pain gives doubt, gives promise, gives hope, gives tolerance, gives pain again. Hope resets the cycle. And because hope feels positive, it hides the cost. Why the future never arrives. This is the most important realization of all. The future was never meant to arrive. It was meant to delay your exit. If real change were the goal, you would see consistent action, accountability, effort without reminders, repair without excuses. Instead, you see words timed precisely when you're about to leave. That timing is not coincidence. Future promises exploit your capacity for growth. If you are reflective, patient, and willing to grow, future promises hit harder. They appeal to your optimism, your loyalty, your ability to see potential, your belief in transformation. Those qualities are not flaws, but in this dynamic, they are used against you. Why hope becomes heavier than pain. At this stage, many people realize something heartbreaking. They are no longer staying because of love. They're staying because leaving would mean grieving the imagined future, the version of him they believed in, the life they were promised, and grieving that feels harder than enduring the present. The truth that restores clarity. A future that requires your suffering in the present is not a future. It's a delay tactic. And the moment you stop organizing your decisions around what might happen, the power of the promise dissolves. In the next part, we'll explore how all three tools, love bombing, guilt, and future promises work together as a single system, and why understanding this system breaks the spell completely. Once you step back and look at the pattern as a whole, something becomes clear. Love bombing, guilt, and future promises are not separate behaviors. They are one system, and that system is designed to keep you emotionally engaged, even when the relationship no longer gives you anything in return. This is why so many people say, I didn't know why I stayed. I felt trapped, but nothing was physically stopping me. I kept thinking things would change. What kept you there wasn't confusion. It was conditioning. The loop always begins with intensity. Love bombing creates rapid attachment. You feel chosen, seen, emotionally important, special. This intensity lowers your defenses and bonds your nervous system quickly. Before you've had time to evaluate consistency, your body is already invested. Then comes withdrawal, and guilt fills the gap. Once attachment is secure, intensity becomes inconsistent. Warmth fades, affection becomes conditional, distance appears. And when you react to that distance, guilt is introduced. You're told, you're too sensitive. You're asking for too much. You're creating problems. The focus shifts from his behavior gives to your reaction. Guilt keeps you trying. Future promises reset hope. Just as doubt grows strong enough to make you consider leaving, the future reappears. A promise, a vision, a soon. Hope quiets your instincts. You stay, not for what is, but for what might be. Then the cycle repeats. Intensity returns briefly. You feel relief. Then, withdrawal again. Then guilt. Then another promise. Each cycle deepens the bond. Not because it's loving, but because intermittent relief is neurologically addictive. Your nervous system learns. This pain leads somewhere. Why the loop feels impossible to escape. The loop doesn't trap you with force. It traps you with emotion. You're constantly oscillating between hope and disappointment, closeness and distance, responsibility and that oscillation keeps your nervous system activated, and activation narrows focus. When you're activated, you don't see the system. You only see the moment. Seeing the loop is the beginning of freedom. The moment you recognize the loop, something changes. You stop interpreting each phase as personal. You stop asking, what did I do wrong this time? You begin seeing repetition instead of randomness, structure instead of chaos, conditioning instead of failure, and that perspective removes shame. This is why awareness alone feels destabilizing at first. When the loop is exposed, the relationship loses its emotional coherence. The highs no longer feel magical. The guilt no longer feels moral. The promises no longer feel reassuring. What remains feels flat, and that flatness can feel frightening. But flatness is not emptiness. It's the absence of manipulation. The most important truth of this stage. You were not staying because you lacked strength. You were staying because the system was designed to keep you there. And systems lose power once they are seen. In the next part, we'll explore what happens inside you when you step out of the loop, and why the first stage of freedom often feels emotionally strange. Once you step back and look at the pattern as a whole, something becomes clear. Love bombing, guilt, and future promises are not separate behaviors. They are one system, and that system is designed to keep you emotionally engaged, even when the relationship no longer gives you anything in return. This is why so many people say, I didn't know why I stayed. I felt trapped, but nothing was physically stopping me. I kept thinking things would change. What kept you there wasn't confusion. It was conditioning. The loop always begins with intensity. Love bombing creates rapid attachment. You feel chosen, seen, emotionally important, special. This intensity lowers your defenses and bonds your nervous system quickly. Before you've had time to evaluate consistency, your body is already invested. Then comes withdrawal, and guilt fills the gap. Once attachment is secure, intensity becomes inconsistent. Warmth fades. Affection becomes conditional. Distance appears. And when you react to that distance, guilt is introduced. You're told, you're too sensitive. You're asking for too much. You're creating problems. The focus shifts from his behavior gives to your reaction. Guilt keeps you trying. Future promises reset hope. Just as doubt grows strong enough to make you consider leaving, the future reappears. A promise, a vision. As soon, hope quiets your instincts. You stay not for what is, but for what might be. Then the cycle repeats. Intensity returns briefly. You feel relief. Then withdrawal again. Then guilt. Then another promise. Each cycle deepens the bond. Not because it's loving, but because intermittent relief is neurologically addictive. Your nervous system learns. This pain leads somewhere. Why the loop feels impossible to escape. The loop doesn't trap you with force. It traps you with emotion. You're constantly oscillating between hope and disappointment, closeness and distance, responsibility and self-doubt. That oscillation keeps your nervous system activated, and activation narrows focus. When you're activated, you don't see the system. You only see the moment. Seeing the loop is the beginning of freedom. The moment you recognize the loop, something changes. You stop interpreting each phase as personal. You stop asking, what did I do wrong this time? You begin seeing repetition instead of randomness, structure instead of chaos, conditioning instead of failure. And that perspective removes shame. This is why awareness alone feels destabilizing at first. When the loop is exposed, the relationship loses its emotional coherence. The highs no longer feel magical. The guilt no longer feels moral. The promises no longer feel reassuring. What remains feels flat, and that flatness can feel frightening. But flatness is not emptiness. It's the absence of manipulation. The most important truth of this stage. You were not staying because you lacked strength. You were staying because the system was designed to keep you there. And systems lose power once they are seen. In the next part, we'll explore what happens inside you when you step out of the loop, and why the first stage of freedom often feels emotionally strange. There comes a stage in healing that doesn't feel dramatic, but it quietly reshapes everything. It's the moment you realize you are no longer trying to be enough for someone who kept moving the goalposts. For a long time, your identity was formed in response to pressure. You adapted, you softened, you explained, you adjusted your needs to fit inside someone else's limitations. Not because you lacked identity, but because survival required flexibility. When the loop ends, that adaptive self has nothing to adapt to anymore. And that's when your real self begins to reemerge. Your identity stops being relational and becomes internal. Inside the narcissistic dynamic, your sense of self was often measured by how calm things were, how pleased he seemed, how little conflict existed, how well you managed his moods. Without realizing it, you learn to evaluate yourself through someone else's emotional state. Now, that reference point disappears, and at first, that can feel unsettling. You ask, who am I if I'm not managing someone? What do I do with all this emotional space? But that question is not confusion. It's real. You stop performing and start existing. One of the clearest signs of this stage, you no longer perform your personality. You don't exaggerate warmth. You don't minimize yourself. You don't edit your reactions to keep peace. You allow yourself to be quiet when you're quiet. Firm when something doesn't feel right. Expressive without apology. Reserved without guilt. This authenticity feels unfamiliar at first, because it was once unsafe. Now, it's natural. Your standards rise without anger. This is important. Your standards don't rise because you're bitter. They rise because you're no longer desperate for connection. You begin noticing inconsistency faster, emotional unavailability sooner, subtle disrespect immediately, and instead of explaining, you disengage. Not dramatically, not angrily, but decisively. You no longer confuse being needed with being valued. This is a profound internal shift. In the past, being needed made you feel important. Now, being respected feels essential. You stop proving. You stop rescuing. You stop overgiving to earn closeness. You understand, connection should not require. You become less reactive and more selective. You don't open emotionally just because someone shows interest. You watch patterns. You observe consistency. You listen to your body. This selectivity is not fear. It's wisdom. This is the self that cannot be manipulated. The version of you that emerges here is not hardened. It's rooted. You trust your internal signals. You respect your boundaries. You recognize when something costs too much. And because narcissistic dynamics rely on self-doubt, urgency, and emotional overfunctioning, they cannot take hold here. This stage quietly changes your future. You don't seek intensity anymore. You seek alignment. You don't chase validation. You choose presence. And that shift determines not just who you date, but how you live. In the final part, we'll close this journey by exploring why this new self doesn't need closure, revenge, or explanation, and how that becomes true freedom. One of the most misunderstood ideas in healing is closure. Many people believe freedom arrives when the narcissist finally explains, apologizes, or admits what they did. But for most survivors, that moment never comes, and waiting for it only extends the bond. True freedom begins somewhere else. It begins when you no longer need another person to confirm what your body already knows. A woman once said, "I realized I didn't need him to understand me. I needed to understand myself." That realization marks the final shift. Why closure was never something he could give. Closure requires accountability, empathy, and consistency. Narcissistic dynamics are built on avoiding all three. If you waited for a sincere apology, a clear explanation, emotional responsibility, recognition of your pain, you were waiting for something incompatible with the system you were in. That doesn't mean you were wrong to want it. It means you were asking the wrong source. When the need for closure dissolves, at this stage, something subtle happens. You stop replaying conversations. You stop rehearsing what you'd say. You stop imagining different endings, not because you forced yourself to stop, but because your nervous system no longer needs resolution from him to feel safe. The story no longer needs a final chapter. It simply loses relevance. You stop organizing your healing around the past. Earlier in the process, healing felt like understanding what happened. Now, healing feels like living forward. You don't ask, why did he do this? You ask, what do I want to protect now? What kind of peace do I want to build? What feels aligned with who I'm becoming? Your attention shifts from explanation to orientation. This is where emotional freedom becomes real. Freedom doesn't feel like victory. It feels like neutrality. You can remember without collapsing. You can see the pattern without rage. You can acknowledge the loss without reopening the wound. That neutrality is not indifference. It's integration. Why revenge and validation lose meaning? At this stage, many people notice. They no longer fantasize about being understood or proven right. Not because they weren't harmed, but because their self-trust is no longer negotiable. Validation from someone who invalidated you loses value once your identity stabilizes. This is the quiet ending most people don't talk about. There's no dramatic goodbye. No final message. No perfect explanation. There is simply a day when You don't think of them first. Your body feels settled. Your life feels yours again. That's how you know the bond is over. Final reflection, and bridge to next video. If you've reached this stage, you didn't get over anything. You outgrew a system that required you to doubt yourself in order to stay connected. In the next video, we'll explore something many survivors ask next. Why do empathetic, self-aware people keep attracting narcissistic dynamics? And how do you stop that pattern for good? If this series helped you see yourself more clearly, stay here. This channel is not about fixing you. It's about helping you stop abandoning yourself for connection. You were never too much. You were just trying to survive in a system that couldn't meet you where you were. And now, you don't need closure to be free. You already are.